Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, again, during the processing, there's still a lot of THC taken out of the product, and it becomes a concentrate that gets very high. What I want to know is what is the process to dispose of that THC, and if there's any licensing or requirements to make sure that it's disposed of properly and not get into the wrong hands.
It might be a question for Mr. Levine in terms of your process. So what happens to the extract? How do you handle the extract?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with the level of 0.3% THC, we can actually take that and add it back into end products and not exceed 0.3% or destroy it entirely. A process of recording that would just be part of the procedure of the manufacturing process.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, so I take it that there's no oversight, no licensing, because this can be a dangerous substance, especially when it gets into young kids, to make sure that the product is not used improperly after it's been, or the concentrate is not used improperly or ends up on the street. That's my concern.
Mr. Levine.
I would say that if there's certain procedures that are put in place for a manufacturer or processor to abide by disposing of it in a proper manner, would be something to consider.
Representative Boston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question was asked and answered, but I will tell you in agriculture, as this crop is continuing to grow and people are starting to look at developing processing plants, one of the big holdups right now is that THC content that is left after the production. And Representative Johnson is right on that it's very potent, very powerful. But Chair, we have some law enforcement people that are here in the audience, and I'd love to have them come up and let us know how they feel about this.
Again, is there anyone here from the law enforcement community that could respond to Representative Poston's question? Representative Poston, we're going to lay this over, and so we will come back to this conversation when we construct our omnibus bill that might offer another opportunity, as well as an opportunity between now and then for you and others to work with. Are there any questions? Representative Johnson and Representative Long.
Chair Mariani, County Attorney, I'm just wondering, instead of getting the grams so people can understand, especially those that are watching us on television, 70, 80 grams, how many joints would that be approximately?
County Attorney Brown, I suspect it has something to do with the size of the joint.
I would say thank you, Mr. Chair, but I'm not sure.
Mr. Chair, I'm
So my law enforcement friends, Mr. Chair, my law enforcement friends have told me for the sandwich bag, so think of the 42.5 grams as a sandwich bag of marijuana. And depending on the person creating those joints, you're probably around 70. It's a fair amount of marijuana.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, County Attorney, I actually looked it up, and the average is about 43 or 0.43 grams per joint. 70 to 80 grams, you're looking at close to 150 to 200 marijuana joints. That's a lot. That's a lot of kids in school getting joints. We want to avoid that. So I do have some concerns. Do we need to look at maybe changing these numbers? Absolutely, but I think we have to look at the proper numbers.
Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I've been told never to do math out loud, But when I look at 42.5 grams and divide that by 0.43 grams, I come closer to 100, not 100 to 200. So just to be clear that, if we are looking at that, and granted, it's been a long time since I've rolled a joint. But, it could be anywhere from really, really small to, I had the Cheech and Chong album when I was young too. So, your point is well taken, Representative Johnson, and I think the issue becomes the criminalization of it that we're talking about. And again, if we go for possession, if we go over 42.5 grams, it becomes a misdemeanor, and over 100 grams, that would then become a gross misdemeanor for possession. And when it comes to issues of sale, more than 42.5 grams will.
Johnson?
Chair Mariani, one thing that was just touched on briefly, and some concerns I've been hearing, especially from the law enforcement world, especially after they saw this bill, it's the issue of the concentrates. The difference between the high concentrated THC stuff and the leaf. And then you have fact, I believe it was in Colorado, they came up with a variety that is super high in THC. So if you have, let's say the 42 grams of leaf material, normal stuff we have here, just 2 grams of some of the concentrate is even stronger than that of THC than that 42 grams. So the question is, how are we going to work this out? Because sometimes it's not the weight that's the problem, it's the concentrate of it.
Dennis Flattery. Please.
Madam Chair, members, my name is Dennis Flaherty, and I'm Executive Director of the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association. We're an association of rank and file officers. We have about 9,000 members spread out across the state. I am here in support of this legislation, and I've had the opportunity to actually have some input into some changes that we felt appropriate that Representative Mariani was kind enough to incorporate. We see this task force as actually doing due diligence and doing it on behalf of the citizens of the state of Minnesota, which we think is very important before making a decision the magnitude of the size of the commercialization of marijuana. The makeup of this task force is diverse. However, we would like to see more representation from the medical and treatment professions and less from the cannabis industry. And by the way, Representative Mariani told me feel free to incorporate some other ideas that I may have thought of since I've talked with him yesterday. And it also does have an appropriation, which I'm very happy to see, because I think it's real important that we're able to bring in government officials from other states that have legalized it, and the bill does say that, but I hoping that it would spell out or specify that these, quote, government officials, quote, would be the regulators and enforcement people from these 10 other jurisdictions that have legalized it, to talk about perhaps the things they may have wished that they had put in the bill. We see this as a group of fact finders on your behalf, and that would provide you, hopefully, the pros and the cons of legalization. And we realize that ultimately it's your decision to make. It's not a secret that law enforcement does presently oppose the legalization. but we think, and it's a huge decision to make, and we just want it to be made after you have all of the facts before you. At this point, we really have not done that. All the states that have taken that step should be heard from, and you should know what they know. I was thinking this morning, there's that old saying that I think is appropriate here, is that you don't know what you don't know. And I think it really applies here. And so I see this bill as an opportunity to learn exactly, to learn to know about all of the downs and dirties and the pluses of the legalization. So I do stand in support of this legislation.
Thank you so much for your support and your willingness to be open to learn to know. Appreciate it. Representative New.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Mariani. I really do appreciate this as probably a more thoughtful approach to this issue than some of the others we've seen. Especially frankly when it comes to, on page 3, this issue of expungement of nonviolent marijuana convictions. Clearly, we've got an issue that needs to be dealt with, particularly as it affects, disproportionately persons of color. That's clearly an issue that we really do need to resolve. I have a little bit of concern and reservation about what the task force will ultimately produce. There was discussion about, this is a good way to evaluate the pros and cons, which I completely agree with. I think it's important that we recognize that there are indeed cons. And my concern is that the task force is going to effectively, they are going to tell us how we should legislate this. Of course, as legislators, we get to make the final decision on that. I'm a little concerned, however, that those recommendations will be made, and then on page 3, lines 3.25 and 2.26, or 3.26, theoretically, I suppose the recommendation to the legislature could be made that this isn't a good idea. However, with lines 3.8 to that point, it seems that they're going to tell us how we should do it, which I think is a little bit contradictory. I think that we are going to be led to believe that we should take these actions, even though it might not be a great idea.
Welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself for the record.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words, and thank you, Representative Mariano, for bringing this bill forward. My name is Randy Anderson, and I'm a person living in long-term recovery. And what that means to me is I haven't had to use drugs, alcohol, or any mood-altering substance since January 9, 2005. I'm also a state-licensed alcohol and drug counselor and a formerly incarcerated individual due to drug-related offenses. We hear this false dichotomy that there's only two stances on this issue, incarceration or legalization, which I believe actually is commercialization. I strongly believe that there's a better way forward than incarceration. There's a better way forward than commercialization, and we need to be devoting our resources, our time, our energy to finding a path between those two extremes. It's well known that when a substance becomes legal, perceived harm, especially with adolescents, is significantly reduced. And when perceived harm goes down, use increases. According to one of our nation's leading scientists, Dr. Nora Volkow, director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the greatest mortality from drugs comes from legal drugs. The moment you make a drug legal, you're going to increase the number of people who get exposed to it, and therefore you increase the negative consequences from its use. When you legalize, you create an industry whose purpose is to make money selling those drugs. And how do you sell it? Mostly by enticing people to take them and entice them to take high quantities. In the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, THC levels, THC, the main psychoactive compound in marijuana that gives the high sensation, averaged between 2 and 4%. By 2014, THC levels hovered around 14%. Thanks to sophisticated farming, cloning techniques, and the demand of users to get a stronger high more quickly, selective breeding has resulted in an average marijuana potency of 20% THC. Some strains exceed 30%. Marijuana concentrates and extracts, much more commonly used in the last 5 years, have THC levels that range from 40 to more than 80%. That is according to the Marijuana Industry Promotional Information and Drug Enforcement Administration reports. Researchers do not yet know the full extent of consequences when the body and the brain, especially developing brain, are exposed to high concentrations of THC. According to the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse in Columbia University, 90% of those people with addiction began using alcohol or other drugs before turning 18. I would also add, I think a member of the committee could be someone in addiction recovery from marijuana use. Regardless of what my state, our state, decides the next step should be, I recommend we move slow and cautiously forward and allow all voices to be heard for and against the commercialization of marijuana. In closing, I would pose the question, what is it we are attempting to accomplish? It's more than obvious the war on drugs failed, so continuing those types of policies benefits no one. However, from an addiction, treatment, recovery perspective, do we really want to introduce another intoxicating substance and make it more widely available in our communities? Thank you.
Thank you so much.